everyone, welcome. And I'm just going to give us a little introduction before we get going about both Dr. Tori and Dr. Mba before we get running. So Dr. Tori will be giving us a bit of a presentation, leading the discussion for about 30-ish minutes, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. And to get us started, give you a little bit of information about how our series is directed this year. So welcome to the COVID-19 pivot version of our Global to Local Speaker Series. This year, all of our programs will be based on racial justice. There are many reasons for doing this, and I won't get into all of the details, but the crux of this is that we need more education about race, racism, and the experience of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the United States and America. Black Lives Matter version 2 has made clear on a mass scale that racism is structurally produced. They have shown us how the police as an institution is racist, which produces racism on individual level. This is but one example of institutional racism. Our goal is to spotlight various examples of institutional racism throughout the year. As such, in this year's series, you will hear about issues ranging from housing to solidarity building between minoritized groups that have historically been pitted against one another, to upend child welfare, a movement to end child welfare as we know it, to borrow Bill Clinton's famous words. Let me also say this is merely the beginning. We do ourselves no favors if we focus on racial justice this year and then be done with it, thinking that we did our part. Racism isn't a new problem, as you are all well aware, and it isn't going away anytime soon, as much as I appreciate the call to be anti-racist across the nation. In fact, I think racism will become more insidious and polarizing in the days to come. We are best equipped to deal with what is coming. As an educational institution, education is the first thing we can offer, not just in the classroom, but beyond it, on Zoom, so even here. So without further delay, please let us welcome Drs. John Tori and Mbuze, and I'm gonna mess your name up, pardon me, Mbuze Mwa. Okay. Let me just go to my notes here real quick. Okay. So today we have with us Dr. John Tori. He is an assistant professor of philosophy and a contributing professor in the Africana Studies unit at SUNY Buffalo State. John was recently appointed to Mayor Byron Brown's commission to recommend police policy and advanced social reconstruction. He holds a BA in philosophy and Spanish from Morehouse College and an MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of Memphis. His research interests are in the intersection of social and political philosophy and African-American philosophy, specifically how social recognition affects moral and political deliberations regarding calls for Black reparations in America, applied ethics, and pre-college philosophy. He has published on the theoretical underpinnings of Black Lives Matter and on doing pre-college philosophy. This year, Dr. Tori was featured in the Unmute podcast. And our discussant for this event is Dr. Mba, a member of the University at Buffalo History Department. His fields of interest include African history, the Atlantic world, the history of slavery and emancipation, gender and sexuality, and social and cultural history. So without further ado, we will turn our time over to John Tori, Dr. John Tori.
It's always so weird to hear like the silent clap. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate this opportunity. Get to communicate with a new audience. This is my first time getting to do any work with UB, so I'm really pleased to cross Main Street, we might say, and go say hello to some colleagues up the block. And I really like what this series is doing this year. I think it's timely, it's necessary, it's important. And I'll also say again, I've got a treat over here for my dog in case she starts screaming. I'll mute real quick, give it a treat, and we should be okay. But if you hear any, clip clopping around, you know who it is. I'm not moving. It's the dog. Okay, so I guess I'll go ahead and just kind of jump into this. I want to make sure to talk some about social recognition, in part because this is, something I'm a big fan of, but it's also because traditionally my research has been about how social recognition impacts claims for reparations for Black people. And it strikes me that there's a wider application for social recognition theory, particularly the kind that I'm working with that's focused on institutions and institutions having an ability to do some social recognition. So what I want to do today is kind of flesh out what we might say is a very difficult question, which is what's the hiccup in trying to get police reform, right? Like what's ultimately kind of been standing in the way. And what I'm going to at least try to pitch to you all today is that social recognition in some way, shape, or form is playing a role. So Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow positions the Black person as one who possesses the mark of the felon. And it's of no fault of their own, besides, of course, being Black. Disparities between white and Black arrests, sentencing for the same crimes committed, and rates of physical harm and death at the hands of police have been in a problematic state for decades, with more moments of violence by police being captured by cell phones and now live streamed into our consciousness. Alexander's research, along with more than done in recent years, suggests that policing Black people is America's business, and business is good. So here's a few pieces of info from the book. If you haven't read it, it's a seminal text of contemporary scholarship, if this is something that you're interested in, so please pick it up. But if you haven't read it, here's a few snippets. In my own words here, I will tell you if I'm quoting her, plagiarism is important, right? We don't want to plagiarize. So upon his election, here we're talking about Ronald Reagan, he mounted the war on drugs, complete with additional funding for federal anti-drug operations and, of course, a massive media campaign that overly sensationalized the devastating effects of crack cocaine on inner city, largely Black neighborhoods. This was done without highlighting the terrible economic blight many of these neighborhoods were suffering before the introduction of crack cocaine to the community. Doing so helped maintain public and congressional support for the war on drugs, which led to police crackdowns on Black communities, as well as many an article typically featuring the stereotypes of crack whores, crack babies, and gangbangers, and those are direct quotes from Alexander, reinforcing already prevalent stereotypes of Black women as irresponsible, selfish welfare queens and Black men as predators, all part of an inferior and criminal subculture. There's more. Legislation that supported the war on drugs began in earnest with the signing of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of '86, which included, quoting here, mandatory minimum sentences for the distribution of cocaine, including far more severe punishment for the distribution of crack, which was associated with Black people, than powder cocaine, which was associated with white people here, end quote. This continued, of course, with an updated version in '88 that included the ability of people to be evicted from public housing by anybody who allows any form of drug-related criminal activity to occur on or near public housing premises. These war on drug policies continued into the Clinton administration, who doubled down on being tough on crime. I'm sure a phrase we've heard over the last 4 to 6 to 8 to 20 years-ish. With a federal 3 strikes and you're out life sentence mandatory minimum. They actually made a movie about that called 3 Strikes, for those of you who ever caught it. Between 1980 and 2005, so this is old data even still, the number of annual drug arrests more than tripled. By 1991, a quarter of young Black men were under the control of the criminal justice system. So that's roughly speaking a generation ago. And when the war on drugs gained full steam in the mid-1980s, prison admissions for African Americans skyrocketed, nearly quadrupling in 3 years, and then increasing steadily until it reached in 2000 a level more than 26 times the level in 1983. Not 2, not 5, not 26 times. That's explosive growth in a terrible way, we might say. A summation of the relationship between Black Americans and the criminal justice system on Alexander's readings is as followed, and this is again another direct quote from her. This is the war on drugs. The brutal stories described above are not isolated incidents. In every state across our nation, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subjected to tactics and practices that will result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. In the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. The law enforcement methods described have been employed almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in jaw-dropping numbers of African Americans and Latinos filling our nation's prisons and jails every year. We are told by drug warriors that the enemy in this way is a thing, the drugs, not a group of people, but the facts prove otherwise, end quote. These facts are supported by research from the Ferguson Commission. So I'm a native of St. Louis, Missouri. If you don't know, Ferguson is about a hop, skip, and a jump. Ain't nothing but it's a suburb of St. Louis. I have family and friends there. I've grown up there my entire lives. I've driven there, driven through. I go visit family and friends regularly when I go home. And of course, Mike Brown was murdered there. So the U.S. Department of Justice uncovered a pattern of racial bias, in fact, in the Ferguson Police Department, and sued Ferguson, Missouri, for a policing pattern that was violating people's First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments. The DOJ argued that the disparities could only be explained, at least in part, by unlawful bias and stereotypes against African Americans. Although Black people made up about 67% of Ferguson's population, 88% of documented uses of force by Ferguson police between 2010 to August of 2014 were against African Americans. And here's a juicy bit of detail. In the 14 police canine bite cases for which racial data was available, the people bitten were Black. There were similar racial disparities in traffic stops. From 2012 to 14, 85% of people stopped, 90% of people who received a citation, and 93% of people arrested were Black. Black drivers were twice as likely as their white counterparts to be searched during vehicle stops, but were also 26% less likely to have any contraband. And this is all without me saying the names of the many Black people killed by police over the years. If we just do a 20-year retrospective, we can start with Sean Bell, I believe, in 99, and we can end it with Breonna Taylor in 2020. Well, I don't know if ended's the right way to describe it, but you can see the pattern here. All of this is to suggest that this is a larger problem than, say, bad apples, as we frequently get told, but an institutional problem of injustice, where injustice is the violation of an individual or group's rights. So, like I said earlier, I kind of want to sketch a possible answer to this question: is what's been a hiccup in the pursuit of police reform, particularly in the aftermath of these injustices, right? So this stuff is documented. It's the Department of Justice, for example. It's not like, somebody sat down and started just taking notes on what they saw. No, we went and sent the investigators in. We sent the researchers in. We sent the data people in, and this is what they pulled out. But for some reason, getting some sort of meaningful tactile reform in the aftermath of this, it seems to be difficult. So let me focus in a little bit tighter here, because that's clearly that's a big old question, right? A multifaceted set of answers. So why not try to tighten up? Given the history and legacy of policing, particularly within Black communities, why have claims by Black people to change how policing happens in their communities been largely ignored? And I think that's what we can see as as Liz mentioned, is BLM 2.0, you might say, right? That the claims have been by Black communities to have changes in how the authorities are engaging with them in meaningful ways here, right? So not necessarily just not ways that are going to provide lip service, but ways that will meaningfully address the disparities we just, this is from 05 maybe, in 2010 and 2014. It wouldn't strike me at all if these disparities have in fact worsened, not plateaued or gotten better. So when Black people, Black communities, and folks who are out there marching are going, well, we want something to shift, this claim is kind of fallen on people who aren't willing to move. So I guess I want to ask, what's the reason why what's driving this lack of movement, right? Generally speaking, if you have some information, try to change based on the information you have. And I think that's actually the first response people have, is that, well, people just are ignoring the data, right? So yeah, the DOJ did this. You got Michelle Alexander's book. You've got all the work you'll see out of from journalists. there's plenty of active information that suggests that we've got data available to support the idea that Black people have been having their rights violated pretty consistently, or at least are regularly at the threat of having their rights violated pretty consistently. And so some people might say that people are just ignoring the data. I like that. I'm in education, so I like teaching stuff. And I think it's important for people to have access to the best possible information on a regular basis. But that the suggestion there is that with more data, you get more of a change. And if there's something that does seem to be pretty consistent, it's that the information becoming available doesn't necessarily prompt policy changes. Something else has to happen. And here I'm thinking of Derek Bell, who's a former a deceased civil rights attorney, wrote a couple of very, very good books. And he is the creator of a theory called racial realism that speaks to the permanence of racism in America. He wrote a short story. I always call it the data storm. It may actually be titled Racism Secret Bonding. But the long and short of it is that there's a thunderstorm of information that keeps on coming like weekly, and it's information about the plight of Black Americans, right? Here's all the stuff that we could go through that people have written books on, that people have experienced. It's all coming down in the rain once a week, and it ruins TV signals, right? So you can't just ignore it. You have to sit there and face it and deal with it. What Bell ultimately thought would happen is that, yeah, people might want to address the storm itself. They don't want to address the root cause of the storm. They want the storm to stop. They want the storm to go away. They want to get back to their normal lives. Again, stop me if you've heard that anytime recently. But it doesn't necessarily prompt a change in their attitude, their approach, or if they even believe in the necessity of the policy changes to benefit the people who have been harmed. It's more of a, can we get back to, can I watch my football again? Because it keeps on coming through during the middle of the football game. By the way, go Bills, 4-0. I had to make sure to wear a little something to rep for the team. But, so people want to get back to normal in some way, shape, or form. They don't actually necessarily believe that this is the right thing to do. And again, to be fair, the DOJ then came out and said Ferguson was on some BS for all intents and purposes, or at least the police department were. I still am very nervous when I drive through North County. There's just, I was home this summer. I get very nervous when I drive through North County, and there's no way around it. And that's not because I'm being irrational about my nervousness. It's because I'm very confident that if given the shot, there's been no policy change, right? The protections I would hope that would come in the aftermath of this data. I mean, it's a searing report, and they're not the only ones, right? Like Ferguson's one of a number of different police departments, memory serves, across the country that basically were on the same sort of pattern. That you can get outed by the highest office for all intents and purposes, like DOJ is the top cop, and nothing happens. That suggests to me I should be nervous, and it suggests to me that something about the data itself doing the job may not actually get things across the finish line. So the data is necessary, the data is important, but it may not walk people down the way we would anticipate it to. So another response we might have for why these claims are getting ignored is, well, policing has racial bias, or it might just be out and out racist in practice, right? And this is something I'm sure we've heard more and more over the last decade, claims of, at the very least, there's, implicit racial bias. At the very least, you can see that manifest again in terms of the disparity in treatment. I've often said that if we were to see a young white woman get shrouded in smoke bombs in the middle of a protest, it strikes me that we would have a significant change quickly in what policies are available. Right. I think about the Time magazine picture with the guy from Ferguson with dreadlocks, RIP, as I think about it, I think he's passed away, who's throwing smoke bomb back, right? And they catch him in that picture. Now imagine if you caught some young woman cowering in fear from the smoke bomb hitting. I think it would look very different, right? So we can acquiesce to the point, right? Probably, yeah. There's not probably, there's racial bias in policing. Whether or not it's out and out racist, we'll roll with it. Like either direction, actually. We'll, take the claim as far as you'd like. We can say, yeah, there's racial bias. We can say policing is racist. One would wonder, though, if police have more bias than the implicit bias that we tend to see across nearly all institutions and across nearly all sorts of professions. And if we're being honest, there's been a lack of change on most of those fronts. And it looks similar to the lack of change we've seen historically with policing Black communities, right? I guess it's the point there is, even if the issue there is the racism, that's not now exclusive to the police. That seems to now be just a problem across all institutions that we're all participating in. So I'm not sure if that explicitly gets to why these claims are ignored. Does that make sense? I'm talking to y'all like I can hear you. I'm getting ready for class later this afternoon. There we go. Okay, so those are two common responses that we hear. And I think they're touching on something right? Like they're touching on something very accurate and true to the world that we're in, that there is racial bias in policing in some way, shape, or form. How deep, how far, how wide, we can sort that out. Does it exist? Absolutely. Is data important? Absolutely. But these things may not be the big fix, so to speak, or the big issues. So, and I think this because these responses actually pigeonhole the possibility for police policy changes into difficult positions to work around. So if the problem is racism and racial bias, well, we don't have great tools available for dismantling implicit bias within institutions if it's just bias. We've got even fewer tools available for dismantling racism within institutions or by members of institutions. So if it is racism and racial bias, well, I don't know where we go to move. And if it's more information alone, we've already gone past this here. It doesn't prompt that change necessarily. And something more is probably needed. So I'd like to offer a third response here, one that may be able to navigate the potential pitfalls while recognizing the importance of both of these approaches. And so my position is that responding to injustice, and to be fair, if your First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments are at the threat of being violated, those are injustices, because injustices are where your rights are being violated, right? My position is that responding to injustice requires the existence of injustice being socially recognized by the appropriate institutions. Where there is no social recognition of the injustice by the institution, there will be no response to that injustice by the institution. And so this encapsulates both responses, right? If there's a lack of education on the matter, well, that's going to impact the ability for the matter to be socially recognized. If it's racism and racial bias, well, that'll also negatively impact the ability for this issue to be socially recognized. So to further flesh this out a little bit, I'm going to explain what's meant by institutional social recognition. So again, I'm focusing at a bird's eye view, so to speak, where we're looking at the institutional effects and how it slides down, as opposed to, say, looking at on the ground and how it might move up. And then I'll offer a little connection there between social recognition and rights possession, so that we get a sense on why the social recognition thing is actually so important. And then lastly, I'll offer a brief glance into what could be done to change how Black people are socially recognized. And that'll be a very brief glance, because I gotta be honest, that's the biggest opening in all the research I do is as to what's next. So I'm looking forward to getting feedback on where you all think changes could be made to help shift social recognition. Okay, so first section, institutions, rights, and social recognition. So let's use law enforcement here as a paradigm example of an institution, because we're talking about cops, right? They recognize and uphold rights. They're also capable of violating the same rights that they recognize and uphold. And two scenes from an award-winning film, Crash. I'm about to say, raise your hand if you've seen it. That's the Zoom talks it throws you off. Okay, So there are two scenes from Crash that depict the ability of police to both violate rights and uphold rights. In an opening scene, there are two LAPD officers and pull over a black couple in an SUV and a black SUV, even though I believe the younger officer, the rookie officer, the younger officer notes that this car does not fit the description from the report that they received. After asking the couple to exit the car, one officer, the older officer, effectively sexually assaults the black woman under the guise of searching her, while the boyfriend, the partner, has to witness this and feel very much, what's the word, emasculated, we'll say, and having to determine whether or not it's worth stepping in to try to protect his loved one against harm at the risk of his own life because of who's involved, namely the police. On the other hand, later on, the same officer that assaulted the woman ends up rescuing her from a burning vehicle. While fictional, it offers a point for the discussion. There's a difference between the institution itself violating rights, which may be reflected by the policy and the culture of the institution, and institutional representatives who violate rights, which may be a matter of personal choices that could be supported by the policies or the culture of the institution. For an institution like law enforcement, which is endowed with the power to legally violate the rights of citizens, my view is that representatives of that institution violating rights is the exact same thing as the institution itself violating rights. Law enforcement officials have the ability to violate citizens' rights because the institution of law enforcement has been granted with the coercive power of the state, which is something we cannot ignore or take for granted when thinking about who's at play and how important the institution sits. The culture of law enforcement and its lack of generating accountability for police officers who violate rights informs the choices made by individual police officers and departments, as we do not make moral, I want to say Larry May said this, I'm paraphrasing here, we don't make moral choices in a vacuum. And we've seen this here in Buffalo with the longstanding struggle to pass Carrio's Law, which would provide protections for cops who want to actually say, hey, my partner's done something wrong, I've seen something wrong, I'd like to try to make a change so that rights violations aren't happening and you won't receive castigation or lose your pension or be fired in the process. And that again suggests the kind of culture of lack of accountability that is a normalized space within the law enforcement as an institution. So while law enforcement clearly has been shown to have some struggles, let me shift here. What does it mean for an institution like law enforcement to socially recognize the rights of a person or a group? Because the key claim I'm making here is that that's the hiccup. There's a lack of social recognition. So what does this mean? Well, one general way of understanding social recognition is that to be socially recognized is to be seen in some relevant manner by the society we're in. Now, what does that mean for the society to recognize someone? What that means to be seen, that's going to differ place to place. But we're here, so we'll work with what we've got in the American context. And here I'm working from the research of Derek Darby, did some great stuff on moral rights possession and rights externalism. He's done great stuff on reparations, really just a fantastic philosopher. So what he comes up with is institutional social recognition. And there she goes. Hold on one moment. Sorry about that. I knew it was going to happen. Middle of the day. It's a sunny day. The dogs are walking. I had a feeling she'd get a sniff of someone. Okay. Where was I? Here we go. So to be seen in some relevant manner by the society, that's what we're talking about here, right? What does it mean to have institutional social recognition? What does that look like? Well, to have institutional social recognition is to be shown institutional respect, okay? And a shorthand way of thinking of institutional respect is having a certain way of acting or being treated socially ratified. That's it. And so, and then there are institutions that have this ability. So Darby is working on a view of rights from Rex Martin, where rights are an established way of acting or being treated. It's a little bit different language than how we might talk about rights normally, but it maps onto the world that we live in. If I have a right to something, that's a right to act. If there's a right against something, like you can't do this to me, that's a right for being treated, right? So these social practices, the view that moral rights is what he's working with, and again, moral rights undergird legal rights, so it's all kind of falling from the same tree. They're not derived from the kind of beings that we are, which is traditionally how we talk about natural rights, but they're grounded in the social practices that we produce. And these social practices are subject to interpretation and evaluation by relevant institutions, wink, wink, like law enforcement. So he further explains, and I'm quoting here from Darby, I shall assume that the social establishment of ways of acting or being treated by certain authorities is required to convert a mere way of acting or being treated into a right. The point's not just that these authorities agree that these relevant ways of acting and being treated constitute rights. The point's much stronger, namely that they can do things that have the effect of turning them into rights, much in the same way that an umpire can turn a pitch into a strike, or a ball and a queen can make somebody a knight, end quote. Okay. So Darby assumes that these social practices that can confer legal rights, that's a paradigmatic example of what it means to show somebody institutional respect. In part because legality he takes to be a strong form of protection for right holders of any kind. So one way he explains this is the conditions for possessing legal rights. And again, remember, the police are here to try to protect our rights. That's the game. S possesses, God, I love philosophy language, here's a random letter. S possesses legal rights if and only if S is acting in a certain way or being treated in a certain way is legally established within an operative legal system, end quote, okay? To legally establish practices requires two activities. You have to recognize the right and enforce the practice as a right. So what it means to recognize the right, again, changes place to place. So our Constitution helps do that. We've got things like the Bill of Rights. We claim them, they're there. Other things might be Supreme Court rulings, right? A judicial ruling will help recognize rights as well. But enforcing and maintaining the right requires authorities in charge of enforcing and maintaining that right. It takes more than words to establish rights. If you're familiar with Hobbes's Leviathan, he's effectively said this before, right? Until you have something like the sword to help make sure the rights are protected, these are mostly just words, claims that don't have protections, okay? It requires actions to enforce and protect those rights. Again, bringing us right back around to the police, the group empowered by the state to enforce and protect those rights. So, on my view, when we're talking about institutional social recognition, it's not simply to be thought well of or looked down on in others' beliefs, right? This isn't an individual thing. It's being afforded a location in what we might call the sphere of moral right holders, right? So you can imagine there's a big space where everybody potentially could be a moral right holder of sorts. If you have institutional respect, you're in the sphere. Now, what rights you've got, that's not guaranteed by being in the sphere. Your rights will be determined by, how did I say this? A consequence. It's a consequence of institutionalized patterns of interpretation and evaluation of social practices and moral claims, okay? When these interpretive and evaluative patterns are institutionalized in spaces like the law, welfare, medicine, pop culture, education, the results of that interpretation and evaluation, whether they're harmful, which I think the claim I'm making here is that they've largely been harmful for Black Americans, or beneficial, which if we're thinking about a concept like white privilege, we're seeing something along that same sort of lines where institutional respect can actually give you a plus instead of always a minus. Those results are all too real. So, you know, my name can get a call back on a job. I have cousins that may not get a name, that they might not get a call back. And it's not because they can't do the work. It's because we have biases against names that may not look Anglo-Saxon sounding, right? Unless my picture was up with John Tory, you may not have had any idea what I was going to look like. That's again the idea of these institutionalized patterns of interpretation and evaluation of social practices having real effects in the world. Okay, so recall the info I began to talk with, right? For how bad it is and how great Alexander's research is about how bad it is, and the DOJ and how bad it's been. Well, what that says to me, based on the framework I'm offering, is that the interpretation and evaluation of Black Americans by much of the law enforcement community is that they are about to commit a crime or just committed a crime, shown by the disturbing disparities in arrests, stops, tickets, fines, fees, et cetera, between Black and white Americans, right? Black Americans appear to be getting evaluated by the criminal justice system as a group that requires additional policing due to the assumption of certain activities taking place in Black communities and harsher punishments because of assumptions about the kind of people Black people are. Okay, so far so good. Got a couple head nods. I see a thumbs up. Okay, we'll keep rolling. All right, so second section, this one moves a little bit faster. We'll talk more about now the connection between reform and social recognition, right? If it's the case that Black people are being evaluated as almost always criminals by an institution that's tasked to uphold and protect rights, then it doesn't take a hop, skip, and a jump to see why rights are not being protected for Black people. To that end, one might be able to say the fly in the ointment of changing police policies is that there is a lack of social recognition by the appropriate institutions of this lack of protection, right? If my view is accurate, there's no reason for reforms to take place because the problem can be shouted from the rooftops, it can be shouted from the streets, it's just not being shouted by the appropriate institution. It strikes me that a reason for this lack of recognition lies in an understanding of Black Americans as victims of historic injustice rather than enduring injustice. And we largely frame the Black American experience as something like it's been really bad and it's kind of gotten better and it's getting a little bit better. And now, we got people who go, I don't know why folks are marching in the streets over something that somebody's already earned. Effectively, the idea is we've already done the job. Yeah, it was bad. We've gotten through that. And for some people, the election of Obama was the watershed moment for them. Like, oh, that's it. We off the hook, wipe the slate clean. It's brand new. We did the job. All of that is a way of viewing the Black experience as rife with historic problems as opposed to enduring problems, right? So I consider anti-Black injustice as both ongoing and fundamental to any interpretation of the Black experience in America. That's not the only thing that's happened, but if you're talking about the Black experience in America historically, diachronically, contemporarily, choose your time window. If it doesn't include anti-Black injustice, it's missing something wholly formative in terms of the material and social nature of what the Black experience looks like. So explaining this continuity of enduring injustice provides what I might call a fundamental concept for evaluating and interpreting Black life that can be a guiding principle for what institutional changes need to be made. If we'd like reform to happen in some way, shape, or form, part of what has to happen is a recognition that this isn't, it's not like we're fighting against the Jim Crow South, we're fighting against the contemporary United States and how it does policing, right? So a concept that I'm endorsing here, and I get this from Jeff Spinner-Haleve, is victims of enduring injustice as the interpreting framework for Black Americans to be used by institutions, by the relevant institutions, by the ones that can make them the umpire-like institutions, right? And I endorse this model, which Spinner-Haleve acknowledges is designed to, and I quote, help the advocates of repairing historical justice respond to the criticisms of the skeptics by reframing the issue at hand, end quote. So I'll give a little bit here on what this enduring injustice concept looks like, and then I'll wrap it up in just a few moments. So rather than focusing on historical injustices and saying that they need to be rectified, and it's not ignoring them either, Spinner-Haleve's model considers how historical injustices persist over time. And that's a conceptual change. It requires a different approach to addressing it than something that's specifically historic injustice. Quoting here from Spinner Haliv, enduring injustice has roots in the past and continues to the present day. And enduring injustice endures over time and often over space as well, end quote. So it's got to have both a historic and a contemporary component, right? If it's happening right now, it's not necessarily enduring in the same sort of way that if it's been happening and continues, we might think of as enduring. So what is it? Some historical injustices have been eliminated, whereas others, like the ones Black Americans face, they haven't been. And it's clear that there has to be some sort of a time constraint for what we mean by enduring injustice. It's got to progress through generations. So I think, I see my dad's watching this, like my dad's in his mid 70s, my grandmother's alive, she's in her, I want to say early 90s. I imagine, and we've all lived in St. Louis for the bulk of our lives, that's enduring injustice over generations, that me, Dad, and Mama Grace will have similar discussions on how to navigate the world as Black people in the city of St. Louis, right? So it makes a distinction between enduring injustice and enduring harm, noting that the enduring harm happens when a group's not living under conditions of injustice, but the historic injustice haunts the group because it's not properly acknowledged or memorialized. That's not the condition for Black Americans. This is the conditions of injustice, which are specific to a particular group, often in the form of rights violations and denials, which again, we're getting to how the police have been able to, the history of the racialized policing it's with a litany of rights violations and denials. Now, in terms of how this enduring injustice persists, because again, we're thinking about, we've got the data, we've got the info. Why hasn't this gotten stopped? We don't have a great cultural memory or a great cultural narrative. Right? We haven't had a clear acknowledgement of the injustice and the role the nation's played in the extended time of the injustice. And so he argues that building a better future requires taking collective memory of the past, and I'll quote here from him. People do not live absent a context. They are storytelling and story living animals. Collective memories are important because our identities, individual and collective, are shaped through memory. Belonging to a group situates people in the world. It gives a point of reference and a point of pride for group members. It helps to tell group members who they are and who they are not. And people belong to many groups, as many liberals point out. Intergenerational groups are particularly important, however, when it comes to enduring injustice. National, ethnic, racial, and religious groups all fit the bill. These are groups that often continue through time, that pass down stories, memories, and cultural practices, traditions, and symbols from one generation to the next. And much of human behavior cannot be made sense of without taking collective memory into account, end quote. So for him, injustices endure when a cultural narrative is broken and not rebuilt, repaired or forgotten, or when collective memory understandably leads to a deep mistrust of the government. So again, 3 generations, we all seem to have the same sort of nervousness come across. That's that collective memory playing a role, okay? And before I wrap things up real quick, I will give one more quote from Spinner Haliv that I very much appreciate. And I think ultimately it gets to the heart of what is desired by whatever we're looking at when we talk about reforms. What Black Americans rightly want are signs from the government that is no longer committed to the racist policies of the past. One way to do this is to show a break with previous governments. There are other ways are needed as well. And that showing a break from, and end quote there, and showing that break from previous governments, doing so will necessarily change the cultural narrative surrounding the Black American experience. So let me wrap up here. Going forward with reforms. Let me pull up my notes. Oh, there may be a handful of things we could do to try to address reforms. Huh. Where are these notes at? I'll have to go off my memory. We've seen over the summertime, public pressure has done a job in trying to generate some sort of reforms. And while that public pressure has looked chaotic to some, angry to others, it's overall been more effective perhaps than we've seen in other ways. Is it the only lever to pull? Probably not. Has it been a lever that got pulled? Yes, it has. Has, as I said before to a friend, they burnt down a Target, they looted a Target, they burnt down a police station. The police got defunded within like a month. So public pressure in some way, shape, or form can help to shape what to do to change that cultural narrative. Because most of that wasn't just the anger you might have seen, the justified anger you might have seen in the streets. There was also a messaging campaign to change the narrative of how policing was happening in Minneapolis, of how policing happening in various other cities, and who's being affected by those kinds of policies. Another way, of course, is to try, again, I like education, a massive re-education campaign of sorts regarding the Black American experience, and framing it again as as inside of the as victims of enduring injustice, as opposed to victims of historic injustice. And lastly, we could try something like trying to get reforms without social recognition. But it strikes me that that may have been, not that that's been the plan so far, or that that's been the approach, but it strikes me that it's going to be a difficult sell to try to get people to buy into changing reforms. And not when I say people here, I'm referring to the institution of law enforcement, but to buy into changing and adopting reforms without adopting a change in terms of who we're responding to and why we're responding to them. Right. So again, as I mentioned, that's the more open space in the work right now, because I think it's, this is one of the reasons why I'm on the commission. We all have a role to play somehow in trying to make these shifts, and so those are three ways that I've seen at least help push sort of reform messages. And fingers crossed we can get more messages and more reforms coming, because it's kind of creepy that me and my dad and my grandma have the same fears when we're driving. Well, Mama Grace can't drive anymore, but we be sharing the same concerns. That should give us pause. Yeah. And so on that note, I will pause, and thank you all very much.
Thank you to Dr. Torrey. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. So a lot to unpack there, but we're going to turn it over to UB's very own Dr. Umba, a member of the University of Buffalo History Department, and he's going to take it away to kind of field the questions and start it going.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Torrey. I was frantically writing. It was a lot of very useful, eye-opening, deeply thought out response to this question of responding to injustice, blackness, identity policy, and struggle with police reform. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure that the audience has a ton of questions. And I want to sort of open it up, and hopefully I have an opportunity again, maybe at the end, to share some reflections. But so, you powerfully frame blackness, and I'm thinking more of I want to sort of take us to the concept of blackness, because much of your talk focus on the activism and why it has become and try to help us understand why it has not been as successful, for instance, as one would expect, given the deluge, what you call a storm of information and data. All right, a track record of Black social activism against injustice, and all of that. So and while you were speaking, I was trying to use that to reflect on what Blackness means then in America. And you powerfully framed Blackness in terms of experienced injustices, rights violations, and denials. And so I was wondering how one might frame Blackness in terms of restorative justice initiatives, right? So there's this level of the experience, but then if we were sort of to shift tack and say, how do we define Blackness by looking at Black communities and looking at what they have done, right? Beyond their experience of institutional inequities. So you allude to the critical role of the collective memory that builds a deep mistrust for the government. That's something that they do. The stories, it, you know, it it is, for instance, surprising to many American families that you, at some point, if you have Black children, you have to call them, sit them down, and talk to them about how do you behave when the police stops you, right? So that's part of what it means to be Black in America. So so you allude to this collective memory that builds a deep mistrust for the government. And in addition to this collective memorialization, you highlight the role of public pressure campaigns, going back to the civil rights movement and up to now, the role of education in framing Blacks as victims of enduring injustice, which is something that a lot of people are involved in. It's sort of a collective project. So in light of those initiatives, how might we frame Blackness in terms of their restorative justice initiatives beyond sort of their experiences of those violations, denials? So if someone to ask, what does it mean to be Black in America, right? So where do we begin to respond to that? And so in addition to that sort of broad question, which personally I have no answer to, so I'm hoping that you would answer that. But in addition to that, I was wondering if you could maybe link it to this or address it separately, but thinking about how significant the idea of reparation in some other, I was listening to your Unmute podcast, and the question of rectificatory justice was sort of huge, and I couldn't help but think that we could learn a lot from some of your reflections on that and what it has to do, with rectificatory justice or distributive justice and police reform, and what does it mean to be Black in America in terms of these initiatives and claims?
Dr. Lumba, were you in my head today, man? You talking my language, you bringing rectificatory justice up and reparations. Blackness is more than just negative. We need to do a whole revalorization. You're talking my language. I'll try to be brief. I want to make sure if there's other questions to get in, I want to make sure to leave time. So I'll try to be brief, but I'm big on this. So here's the shorthand answer. Honestly, the same claim I make about social recognition impacting, the lack of protections, the lack of rights. I make that to be the exact same claim for reparations. That effectively, reparations is made off of a claim for a right to rectification because of rights violations. But if the appropriate institutions don't socially recognize that claim, well, then you don't have it. It has nothing to do with the argument made. It has nothing to do with the history. It has everything to do with whether or not institutions ultimately recognize the claim being made. Again, turning a pitch from a ball to a strike. We're trying to throw strikes. They're like, we didn't even see it. But, no pitch was thrown. That's kind of been the response. In terms of what it means to be Black, I think of Dr. Bill. Oh, she's going to go again. Hold on one second. Caught her just in time. There we go. I think of Dr. Bill Lawson's work on social disappointment and the Black sense of self. And I think about that because he kind of outlines, I'm of two minds of this. I think on the one hand, when we think about what it means to be Black in America, it can't just be all the negative, because that's not all it is, right? It's not just rights violations, rights denials, abject poverty, and second-class citizenship for all intents and purposes, right? Like it's more than that. There's stuff that's been built through that. However, that experience is something that kind of undergirds that Black sense of self in America. And one of the things he says is, when you see the video of the and he wrote this probably in the early 2000s or mid 90s, right? When you see the video of the cop shooting somebody and you go, oh, he's finna get off, they're not going to, it's going to be the same old thing. And then, when people get in the streets and you see, okay, there's pressure getting mounted, they're going to do a grand jury thing, right? Like maybe something will happen, and then nothing happens, right? Or you get, it was illegal to shoot into the other home, not to kill him, right? that disappointment you get where you have, because it's funny, we actually, you know, I mentioned something about a mistrust in the government. We also have a faith in the government to do the right thing. And when it doesn't, we feel a special kind of disappointment. And so that's, you know, on one end, that's where I think about what it means to be Black. In terms of reparations and rectificatory justice, that's the big push. I strongly believe, you know, I want, you know, give me all the money you can give. I want that. It's all symbolic. We can sort out the pay. We can sort that out. That's symbolic. Give me policy changes, right? So rectificatory justice for Black Americans would necessarily require police policy changes, because otherwise, I've said this before, half the money we're going to give is going back to the state in fines and fees, right? You give us reparations, we're bailing people out more than likely. We're paying away old tickets. We're paying away old tax stuff that we've been unfairly getting hit with, et cetera, et cetera. Half the money's going to go back. So that clears us up in terms of having debts. If you want to clear us up from not having future debts, got to change police policies. Otherwise, you know, that same money, half of my money is going to go to dealing with the people who've been harmed prior to. The other half of my money is going to go to the people who are still getting harmed. Right. And in either instance, something has to shift as far as what police policy looks like, and whether it's defund, abolish, however it gets there, that has to be part of a rectificatory justice project. That's whole hog. It had, like, you know, to me, reparations is one part of the pig. I want the whole pig. We need the whole thing. And in that kind of way, you know, systems change is part of rectificatory justice as far as how I see it. It strikes me that it's not rectifying anything. And that's also a concern I have about restorative justice, particularly in the Black American context. I don't know what we're trying to restore to. So when I was first doing this research, restorative justice is where I started off at. I don't know what this relationship is going to get restored back to. There's a new relationship that has to be creative in that kind of way. It strikes me that restorative justice works great for the interpersonal and in the small space. But if we're talking at the institutional level and how deep in this is going, restoration, where are we going back to? Rectification, rectify the harms done in every way possible so that we can move forward into new relationships. And which I think is still the goal of restorative justice, to create those new relationships, right? Get that relationship back, that moral equality back. I think rectificatory justice keeps that same thrust for the desire for moral equality, but it does not, it doesn't end there. There we go. It doesn't end there. I hope I got to it. We're going to have to talk some more, Dr. Mbah. We're going to talk some more. I hope I answered some of the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. One of the questions is whether there is an example of such recognition by an American institution, a first step in attaining this social recognition. If basically beyond the police force, there has been any institution you are aware of from your studies, research, that have, even if they have not succeeded, have sort of made the model ways that this can be done.
In terms of models, the closest thing I've seen from America to acknowledge, and this is again coming from government institutions, of acknowledging, say, harms that would include policing harms. There was an apology written in 2008, I believe, by the House, either 08 or 09, and it was a long form apology that went detailed, right, from a legacy of from the history of slavery, through the history of Jim Crow, through the history of redlining, through oppressive police tactics. Like, I mean, it ticks it down pretty consistently, pretty straightforwardly, and says we have to apologize, we have to take up for that, and we have to try to do better. We have to change these policies. Now, it passed the House, it didn't pass the Senate. So my gut tells me it was probably written either in late 08 or early 09, before while there was a lame duck Senate going on, perhaps. But either way, it didn't get all the way up to the White House. It did get past the House. Another spot I've seen this in terms of actually providing something like rectificatory justice, 1988 Civil Liberties Act signed by Reagan that gives reparations back to formerly Japanese and the Japanese Americans who were interned. Interned is a very polite way of calling it a concentration camp on American soil during World War II, right? So in that actual act, the three reasons for doing for pinning up the Japanese American citizens were racial hysteria, wartime hysteria, racial prejudice, and I always forget what the third one is, but it's not nearly as important. It's important, but it's not nearly as important as we're gonna say, we were hopped up on war and we were hopped up on racism, and we made a decision accordingly. but it's in there saying we made an error, right? We made a fundamental error. There we go, right? So in the chat, we've got the back end of what that official recognition might look like. We get the back end of it with the what if you do critical race theory and racial trainings, you're being anti-American. So there's the backside of that, right? But so on the front end, say we did it. It's on us. This was our fault for having racial hysteria. It does make me wonder, how do you, based on this order from the White House right now, how do you talk about what happened to the Japanese American? Because if you got to tell that tale honestly, they didn't do anything wrong. We've admitted that as a nation that they didn't do anything to deserve this, that they lost all kinds of money and businesses and standing, space, lives as a result. How do you teach that? I mean, if somebody hears that and they say that's un-American, I don't know how to respond to that. That's what we did, right? Like, so again, yeah, boy, I forgot that White House order threw me off. Like, oh my God, I forgot about how bad that thing is, and how it really is helping to perpetrate, I think, a lot of the same sorts of, the concerns about lack of social recognition. Yeah, this is how that kind of permeates at a systemic level.
Well, thank you both so much. I know we're right at 1:33, so we've hit our mark. I want to be conscious of everyone's time, but thank you both, Dr. Torrey and Dr. Mbath, for joining us today, and for everyone who joined us to watch. And we so appreciate that, and we appreciate the work that you're doing. So thank you.